When people think of royal families, they usually picture European palaces and British titles, but some of the most dramatic royal lives of the last century belong to the lost royal household of Iran. And right at the center of that history is a woman most people outside the Middle East have rarely heard about, Princess Shahnaz Pahlavi, the first child of the last Shah of Iran. She was born a princess, the daughter of a king and an Egyptian princess, surrounded by all the wealth and ritual of a royal court. Yet from the very beginning, her life was marked by disappointment, separation, and complicated family politics. She was never the crown prince her father's dynasty wanted, but unlike many of her half-siblings, she eventually found a quieter, more stable life far away from the palace drama that shaped her childhood. Shahnaz came into the world on October 27, 1940 in Tehran. Her father was then Crown Prince Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, who would become Shah, and her mother was Princess Fawzia of Egypt, sister of King Farouk. On paper, it was a glamorous political match between two royal houses. In reality, Shahnaz's arrival exposed just how much pressure there already was inside that marriage and inside the Pahlavi dynasty. Before she was born, the court had built up enormous expectations. Everyone was hoping for and frankly assuming that the first child would be a son, a future Shah. Celebrations were already being planned. But when the baby was delivered and doctors announced it was a girl, the festive mood evaporated almost instantly. The planned celebrations were quietly canceled. Behind those reactions was a strange and ominous superstition. Years earlier, Reza Shah, the founder of the dynasty and Shahnaz's grandfather, had been told a prophecy. If the first child born to the reigning family was a girl, the king would one day be killed or forced into exile. It sounded absurd, but in a monarchy built on symbols and omens, it stuck in people's minds. When Shahnaz was born a girl, many in the family saw it as a bad sign. Ironically, decades later, that prediction would align with what actually happened to her father's reign. Still, for all the disappointment around him, Mohammad Reza Shah seemed to feel at least some pride in his daughter. The name he chose said it very clearly. Shahnaz can be translated roughly as the king's pride. The problem was that his family and the political world around him wanted a male heir much more than he wanted a baby girl. No one felt the impact of that more than Shahnaz's mother, Princess Fawzia, already struggling to adapt to life in Tehran, in a court that could be cold and competitive. Fawzia now found herself blamed, subtly or openly, for not producing a son. Her in-laws were increasingly distant, and in some cases openly unfriendly. Her husband became more detached emotionally. Over time, the isolation took a serious toll on her mental and physical health. She sank into depression. By May 1945, the situation had become unbearable for her. Fawzia made the decision to leave Iran and return to Egypt. She took refuge in her homeland and began the process of pursuing a divorce. At that moment, Shahnaz was only 5 years old. The Shah insisted she remain in Tehran until her mother returned, a return that everyone in Iran hoped for and Fawzia had no intention of making. The Iranian side initially refused to recognize Fawzia's wish to end the marriage. Instead, they tried a different strategy, using Shahnaz as an emotional link. The Shah and his powerful twin sister, Princess Ashraf, quietly encouraged newspapers and magazines in Iran to publish flattering photos and articles about the little princess. The idea was simple and ruthless at the same time. Get those images in front of Fawzia in Egypt and hope that her maternal instinct would pull her back to Tehran. Reports suggest the Shah even leaned on the Iranian ambassador in Cairo to try to bring her back, but none of it worked. Fawzia was determined. She would not return to a marriage and a court where she had been miserable. After years of back and forth, on 17 November 1948, the Iranian authorities finally recognized the divorce. Publicly, they gave a polite excuse. They said Iran's climate had been too harsh for Queen Fawzia's health, and the Shah had very graciously agreed to dissolve the marriage with the Egyptian king's sister. Privately, there was one major condition he insisted on. Their daughter, Shahnaz, would remain in Iran and grow up in his country, not in Egypt. So from a very young age, Shahnaz found herself without her mother's presence and without much consistent attention from her father, who was preoccupied with running the country and later finding another wife. She was surrounded by palace staff and relatives, but in many ways, she was emotionally on her own. Her relationship with her paternal grandmother, Queen Mother Taj al-Muluk, was also strained. Members of the Pahlavi family already tended to overlook Shahnaz because she wasn't the prized male heir. On top of that, Shahnaz grew up believing her grandmother had helped drive her mother out through cruel and unfriendly behavior. That left a lot of bitterness and distance. One person who did offer real warmth was her aunt, Princess Shams, the Shah's elder sister. Shams doted on Shahnaz and became a key figure in her upbringing. The young princess spent a lot of time under Shams's care and with palace servants, and she attended the Barsabeh kindergarten in Tehran. Like other royal children of that era, she was taught by mostly European governesses and tutors, many of them French, reflecting the Pahlavi court's obsession with European manners in education. When she finished kindergarten, the Iranian court actually created a small primary school specifically for her. The student body was carefully chosen from the children of top military officials and prominent noble families. It was less about preparing her for real life and more about shaping a future queen-level figure surrounded by the right social circle. At the age of 8, Shahnaz was sent to Switzerland to a boarding school often referred to as Mary Joseph School. She stayed there for 5 years. Those were key formative years, and during that time, contact with her father was minimal. The Shah visited rarely. Her mother, on the other hand, made the effort to come to Switzerland and spend time with her. Those visits were a huge source of comfort and stability for Shahnaz. They were the closest thing she had to a normal parent-child relationship. After completing that phase of her schooling, she was sent to the United States, where she rejoined her aunt Shams and her grandmother, Queen Mother Taj, for a time. It was another relocation in a life already defined by constant movement between countries and households. In 1951, the Shah remarried. His second wife was Soraya Esfandari Bakhtiari, a beautiful young woman from a prominent Irano-German family. Soraya became stepmother to a 10-year-old Shahnaz. By all accounts, Soraya really did try to build a warm relationship with her stepdaughter, but Shahnaz had grown up hearing her grandmother and some aunts speak unkindly about Soraya, criticizing her behind the scenes. That poisoned the well early. When Shahnaz was 11 years old, the Shah allowed her to spend the summer in Tehran. You might assume she stayed in the main palace with the Shah and Queen Soraya. She didn't. Instead, she was placed in a smaller house near the royal residence. That physical separation mirrored the emotional distance still present in the family.
Over time, the relationship between Shahnaz and Soraya improved. As she got older, Shahnaz came to see Soraya in a more sympathetic light. When the Shah later decided to divorce Soraya because she couldn't give him children, Shahnaz was among those who opposed the divorce, which suggests that whatever tension had existed early on had turned into real affection and respect. As Shahnaz moved into adulthood, the question of her marriage became political. Mohammad Reza Shah initially had grand plans. He hoped to marry his eldest daughter to King Faisal II of Iraq. It would have been a classic royal alliance, a union meant to strengthen ties between Tehran and Baghdad. Faisal was considered handsome, charming, and of course, a head of state. On paper, it was a perfect match for a princess. But Shahnaz wanted none of it. She did not want her marriage to be a political tool. She was not attracted to Faisal and refused to accept a role as a pawn in regional strategy. To his credit, the Shah respected her wishes. Despite all the pressure and tradition, he backed away from forcing that alliance on her. Instead, on October 11, 1957, at age 16, she married someone much closer to home, Ardashir Zahedi, at Golestan Palace in Tehran. Ardashir was the son of General Fazlullah Zahedi and would later become Iran's ambassador to the United States during the 1960s and 1970s. The ceremony itself was surprisingly low-key for a royal wedding. Contemporary reports, including one in the Ocala Star Banner, quoted the Shah as wanting a simple event because, in his words, there was no reason to boast about being king of a poor, hungry people. The couple later had a daughter, Mahnaz, often also referred to as Zahra Mahnaz. But the breakup did not last. In 1964, Shahnaz and Ardashir divorced. The breakup was widely attributed to his infidelity, which she reportedly could not tolerate. Another man in her life had let her down. Afterward, she showed clear signs of depression, and it's not hard to see why. A childhood marked by her parents' divorce and her father's emotional distance, followed by the betrayal of her first husband. Around this time, a new figure entered the picture. Khosrow Jahanbani, the son of General Amanullah Jahanbani. Khosrow came from a noble military family, but personally leaned toward the countercultural, artistic world of the era. He was studying painting and had something of a hippie image. Friends say he had admired Shahnaz for years, even before her first marriage. After her divorce, Khosrow became a close companion. He tried to soothe her pain, but the way he did that was destructive. Reports from those years say he introduced her to LSD and marijuana, which led to a serious dependency. For a royal family obsessed with image and control, this was a nightmare. When the Shah learned how deeply involved Khosrow was in his daughter's drug use, he was furious. There were even plans discussed to have Khosrow arrested and imprisoned, but Shahnaz stood by him. Despite the father's rage and opposition, she decided she wanted to be with Khosrow not just as a companion, but as a husband. In February 1971, she married him at the Iranian embassy in Paris. The Shah was strongly against this second marriage at first. To him, Khosrow represented everything he didn't want for his daughter: drugs, unconventional lifestyle, a challenge to authority. But his stance gradually softened, largely thanks to the mediation of his third wife and current empress at that time, Farah Pahlavi. Farah convinced him to accept the union, at least on certain terms. Those conditions included Shahnaz and Khosrow basing themselves in Switzerland and avoiding other more politically sensitive locations. There was also a clear expectation that Shahnaz would give up drugs. The marriage, although controversial at its start, turned out to be stable by royal standards. They had 2 children together, a son, Kai Khosrow, and a daughter named Fazia after Shahnaz's Egyptian mother. The couple stayed together until Khosrow's death in 2014, long after the monarchy itself had fallen. Before his own death, Mohammad Reza Shah tried to organize his estate among his children. In his final division of property, he left 8% of his assets to Shahnaz and 2% to his granddaughter, Zahra Manaz Zahedi. After he died, Shahnaz discovered that she had received a smaller share than some of her half-siblings, including Farhanaz and Layla, who reportedly got around 15% each. Feeling that this was unfair, she filed a legal case in a French court to challenge the distribution. Even so, the portion she did receive was still substantial enough to guarantee a very comfortable life in exile, far removed from the political battles and power struggles that had defined her earlier years. When the Iranian Revolution erupted in 1979 and the Shah's regime collapsed, Shahnaz, like the rest of the Pahlavi family, could not return home. She settled in Switzerland, where she has lived ever since, largely out of the public eye. She later acquired Swiss citizenship, anchoring herself there permanently. Because her mother had been an Egyptian princess, the Egyptian state also recognized that connection, and in December 2013 granted Shahnaz Egyptian citizenship as well. In a sense, the girl who had once been the symbol of 2 royal houses, Iran's and Egypt's, finally had official ties again to both. Looking at her life as a whole, it's a blend of privilege and pain. On the painful side, Shahnaz experienced her parents' divorce and her mother's departure when she was only 5, the emotional neglect of a father always focused on the next wife and the next heir, a difficult relationship with her grandmother, a failed first marriage marked by betrayal, and a long struggle with depression and addiction. She carried the name the King's Pride, but in many ways, she never received the consistent love and validation from her father or the Pahlavi family that she longed for. She simply wasn't the son everyone had wanted. Yet, compared to some of her half-siblings, her fate after the revolution was less harsh. She did not spend her adult life in the public political spotlight. She did not become the symbolic leader of an exiled cause. She built a quieter existence in Switzerland with her own family, away from coups and counter-coups, away from palace intrigue. The mother who'd left her in childhood was eventually able to visit her regularly in Europe. For a woman whose early life had been defined by separations, that ongoing contact later in life was a kind of emotional repair. In the end, Shahnaz Pahlavi's life shows a side of royalty that rarely makes it into fairy tales. Titles, palaces, and famous last names don't guarantee happiness. A princess can be both privileged and deeply wounded at the same time. For Shahnaz, the monarchy that expected a son instead got a daughter who spent much of her life trying to step out of the shadow of that disappointment, and who, far from the thrones and fanfare, finally carved out some measure of peace on her own terms.